February 1943. A German maintenance sergeant crouches beside an olive-drab motorcycle, his hand still trembling as he removes the air cleaner cover. The Harley-Davidson WLA sits silent in the captured American motor pool, surrounded by dozens more just like it. He's been a mechanic for 15 years, trained on the finest German engineering, worked on BMWs that represented the peak of European motorcycle design. But what he's looking at now makes his throat tighten with a realization that has nothing to do with mechanics and everything to do with mathematics. This isn't just a motorcycle. It's a message written in steel and gasoline. And the message is simple. America can bury us. The motorcycle before him is crude by German standards. The 45 cubic inch flathead engine, a side valve design that BMW abandoned years ago in favor of more efficient overhead valve technology, represents engineering that seems almost primitive. The Springer front suspension is outdated. There's no rear suspension at all, earning these machines the nickname hardtail among American riders. The 3-speed handshift transmission is simple, almost agricultural in its design. Everything about this machine screams mass production over refinement, quantity over quality. But that's precisely what makes it terrifying. The sergeant runs his fingers along the frame. The welds are good. Not exceptional, not the precise work of a master craftsman, but consistently good. The paint is thick and even. The components fit together with tolerances that suggest proper tooling and quality control. This motorcycle was built fast, but it was built right. And then he sees the manufacturer's plate, serial number 42, WLA 43576. The 42 designation means production year 1942. Even though this machine might have rolled off the assembly line in 43, the Americans standardized their wartime production, simplified their record-keeping, focused on output. The number that follows makes his stomach drop. Serial 43576. That means at least 43,576 of these machines had been produced by the time this one left the factory. 43,000 of one model from one manufacturer in less than 2 years of war production. He thinks about the BMW R75, Germany's finest military motorcycle. Approximately 16,500 units produced between 1940 and 1945. 5 years of maximum war production, yielding fewer machines than the Americans built of this single model in 18 months. And the Americans aren't rationing steel for these. They aren't choosing between building motorcycles or building tanks. They're building both. They're building everything. The story of the Harley-Davidson WLA began in 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. The United States Army, watching the conflict consume Europe, issued specifications for a military motorcycle. They wanted something simple, something reliable, something that could be produced in vast quantities by workers who might never have built a motorcycle before. Harley-Davidson responded with the WLA, a militarized version of their civilian model WL. The W designated the 45 cubic inch flathead engine family. The L indicated high compression, though in reality, the Army version used medium compression for reliability. The A stood for Army. The design was deliberately conservative. The engine displaced 739 cubic centimeters, producing a modest 25 horsepower at 4,500 revolutions per minute. Not impressive by performance standards, the BMW R71 produced 22 horsepower from a similar displacement, while the more advanced R75 generated 26 horsepower. But power wasn't the point. The WLA's side valve engine was nearly indestructible. The low 5-to-1 compression ratio meant it would run on 74-octane gasoline, fuel so poor that high-performance German engines would destroy themselves trying to burn it. The air-cooled design eliminated vulnerable coolant systems. The simple valve train had fewer parts to break. Everything about the engine prioritized survival over performance. The transmission was equally straightforward. 3 speeds, hand-shifted via a lever on the left side of the tank with a foot-operated clutch. German riders found this arrangement backward. Their BMWs used foot shifters and hand clutches, but it worked. The Springer front fork provided adequate suspension through 2 parallel springs and a friction damper. The rigid rear frame had no suspension at all, relying on a sprung seat to absorb road shock. Again, crude but functional. What made the WLA revolutionary wasn't its design. It was the industrial system that produced it. In 1941, Harley-Davidson was still primarily a civilian company building motorcycles for police departments and recreational riders. By 1942, the company had transformed into a war production facility, running 24 hours a day. The Milwaukee factory floor became an assembly line where women who had never touched a wrench before the war built motorcycles with precision that would have been impossible in peacetime. Production numbers told the story. In 1940, Harley produced several hundred WLAs as evaluation models. In 1941, production ramped to several thousand. In 1942, after Pearl Harbor, the assembly lines roared to life. 10,000 motorcycles, 20,000, 30,000. By the end of the war, Harley-Davidson had produced over 90,000 WLA and WLC motorcycles, the WLC being a slightly heavier variant built for the Canadian Army. But that wasn't all. The company also manufactured enough spare parts to build an additional 30,000 motorcycles. Complete inventories of engines, transmissions, frames, wheels, and every component necessary to keep these machines running in combat conditions for years. For this achievement, the United States War Department awarded Harley-Davidson the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Wartime Production twice. First in 1943, then again in 1945. The ceremony was elaborate, with high-ranking officers present, aircraft flying overhead in formation. Workers received small pins to wear on their lapels, marking them as soldiers of the production line. This wasn't propaganda. It was recognition of an industrial miracle. The WLA's simplicity enabled this production surge. Each motorcycle required approximately 3,000 individual parts, a fraction of what a B-24 Liberator bomber needed, but still a complex assembly. Yet the design allowed for rapid training of new workers. A woman who had been a secretary or a shop clerk 6 months earlier could learn to install engines or wire electrical systems in a matter of weeks. The tolerances were forgiving enough that minor variations in component manufacturing didn't cause problems. Everything was designed for what modern engineers would call ease of assembly. Quality control was surprisingly rigorous. Despite the pace of production, each WLA underwent testing before acceptance by military inspectors. The Army rejected machines that didn't meet specifications, forcing corrections and maintaining standards even during the production surge. The rejection rate remained low, suggesting that the simplified design worked as intended, building quality through smart engineering rather than intensive craftsmanship. Then came distribution. Over 30,000 WLAs went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements. Thousands more went to Britain, Canada, China, India, South Africa, and other allied nations. American forces received the remainder, deploying them across every theater of war, from the European theater of operations to the Pacific Islands, from North Africa to China, Burma, and India. The WLA became the most widely distributed American motorcycle in history, serving in climates ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat, from desert sand to jungle mud. Back in Tunisia, the German sergeant has moved beyond the first motorcycle. He's inspecting the motor pool, counting machines. 73 WLAs in this depot alone. 73 motorcycles that represent maybe 3 days of American production. He thinks about the industrial capacity required to build these machines and ship them across the Atlantic Ocean, across thousands of miles of submarine-infested waters, and then distribute them to forward units. The Americans lost ships to U-boats. Everyone knew that. But they built replacements faster than Germany could sink them. These motorcycles crossed the ocean in cargo holds, packed and crated, arriving in North Africa to support operations thousands of miles from their manufacturing plant. The sergeant examines a maintenance log left behind during the American retreat. The WLA in question has 3,200 miles on the odometer. The maintenance record shows regular oil changes, 1 clutch adjustment, 2 sets of spark plugs, 1 carburetor cleaning. That's it. 3,200 miles of military use in desert conditions, and the most significant maintenance was changing spark plugs. He thinks about the BMW R75s in his unit, magnificent machines with overhead valve engines, 4-speed transmissions with reverse gear, shaft drive to both rear wheel and sidecar wheel, differential transfer case for low-range gearing. Engineering masterpieces that required constant attention from skilled mechanics. The R75 could handle terrain the Harley couldn't touch, could carry heavier loads, could outperform the American bike in almost every measurable way. But it needed trained mechanics, specialized tools, steady supplies of spare parts, and most critically, time. Time the Wehrmacht didn't have. The German military had started the war with approximately 150 motorcycle manufacturers ready to supply machines. The shell program rationalization reduced that to 30 before the war began. By 1940, heavy motorcycle production concentrated in just two companies, BMW and Zündapps. Total production of the BMW R75 from 1940 to 1945, approximately 16,500 units. Total production of the Zündapps KS 750 in the same period, approximately 18,700 units. Combined German heavy motorcycle production, around 35,200 machines. American production of just the WLA, over 90,000 plus parts for 30,000 more. The mathematics was brutal. For every German heavy motorcycle built, the Americans produced 3 Harley-Davidsons, but the disparity went deeper than simple numbers. The Germans were building their motorcycles using skilled labor, precision tooling, and materials increasingly scarce. As the war continued, every BMW R75 required resources that could have built something else. A weapons carrier, an artillery prime mover, a light reconnaissance vehicle. Every hour of skilled labor invested in motorcycle production was an hour not spent building tanks or aircraft or submarines. The Americans built motorcycles almost as an afterthought, a minor line item in an industrial mobilization so vast it defied comprehension. While Harley-Davidson built 90,000 WLAs, American factories produced over 86,000 tanks, almost 300,000 aircraft, 2 million army trucks, and nearly 193,000 artillery pieces. The United States manufactured almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war and did so while maintaining civilian production that would have been the envy of any European nation at peacetime levels. The German sergeant finds an ammunition box attached to one of the Harleys. Inside tools, a simple toolkit designed for field maintenance. Wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, spark plug sockets, everything a soldier would need to perform basic repairs. The tools are stamped steel, nothing fancy but adequate. Every motorcycle came with these tools. 90,000 toolkits distributed across the globe, ensuring that broken machines could be fixed in the field without returning to depot-level maintenance. He thinks about German supply chains already stretched to breaking by the vast distances of the Eastern Front. Spare parts for BMW motorcycles came from Munich, routed through a distribution system designed for a much smaller military operating in Central Europe. Now German units fought from Norway to Egypt, from France to the outskirts of Stalingrad, and the supply system couldn't keep pace. A BMW with a broken transmission might sit useless for weeks waiting for a replacement to arrive from Germany if it arrived at all. Meanwhile, Allied bombing was systematically destroying German industrial capacity, reducing production while simultaneously increasing the rate at which equipment needed replacement. The WLA represented a different philosophy entirely. Build it simple. Build it tough. Build so many that losses don't matter. If a WLA broke down and couldn't be fixed quickly, the Americans abandoned it and requisitioned another from the motor pool. There were always more motorcycles, always more spare parts, always more ammunition boxes and jerry cans and tires and everything else the war consumed. The sergeant picks up a discarded manual, the technical manual for the WLA, printed in English but with clear diagrams. The level of documentation surprises him. Exploded view diagrams showing every component and how they fit together. Specifications for every tolerance and adjustment, troubleshooting guides for common problems. The Americans had industrialized not just production, but also maintenance and training. A soldier with minimal mechanical knowledge could follow these manuals and perform repairs that would require a trained mechanic on German equipment. This systemization extended beyond the motorcycle itself. The United States Army created entire supply chains specifically for motorcycle support. Spare parts were categorized, cataloged, and distributed through a depot system that ensured forward units received what they needed. When units requisitioned parts, those parts arrived. Maybe not immediately, but they arrived. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked at a scale the German military couldn't match. Back in Germany, engineers and designers had created magnificent machines. The BMW R75 with its innovative 3-wheel drive system could climb obstacles that would stop the Harley cold. The Zündapp KS750 with its similar capabilities proved equally impressive in testing. Both motorcycles represented the peak of pre-war German engineering prowess, but magnificence required resources Germany didn't have. The Germans tried to compensate through cleverness. In August 1942, BMW and Zündapps agreed to standardize parts between their motorcycles. The goal was to create a hybrid machine that combined the best features of both designs. Designated the BW43, the standardization program achieved 70% parts commonality between the two manufacturers. This simplified supply somewhat. A mechanic could cannibalize a destroyed Zündapp to repair a BMW or vice versa, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of insufficient production. Meanwhile, American industry operated at a pace that seemed impossible to German observers. Reports from captured documents revealed that the United States had doubled its industrial production between 1940 and 1944. Doubled. An economy already the largest in the world had grown to produce more military equipment than Britain, the Soviet Union, and all Axis nations combined. German propaganda tried to dismiss these reports as American exaggeration. They weren't. The sergeant starts one of the captured Harleys. The engine fires immediately, despite sitting unused for days. The magneto ignition, independent of the battery, ensures reliability. The flathead engine settles into a steady idle, that characteristic potato-potato sound of a V-twin. He blips the throttle. The response is immediate. The engine pulls cleanly from low revs to higher speeds without hesitation. This isn't a sophisticated engine. It's a farmer's tractor engine in motorcycle form, but it works and it keeps working. He lets the engine run while he considers what this motorcycle represents. Not just a machine, but a symptom of a larger problem that no amount of German tactical brilliance or superior individual weapon design could overcome. The Wehrmacht had been designed to fight short, decisive campaigns using superior training and equipment. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, strike fast, achieve objectives before the enemy could mobilize, win before industrial capacity became decisive. That strategy had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It had even worked initially in the Soviet Union. But now the war had become exactly what Germany couldn't afford, an extended conflict of attrition where industrial capacity determined outcomes. And in that type of war, the nation that could build 90,000 motorcycles as an afterthought while simultaneously producing hundreds of thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of tanks would inevitably win. The WLA wasn't better than the BMW R75. In most performance metrics it was worse, but the WLA existed in overwhelming numbers, supported by inexhaustible supplies and maintained by soldiers following comprehensive manuals. The R75 existed in limited quantities, supported by supply chains that couldn't keep pace with combat losses, maintained by mechanics who were themselves becoming increasingly scarce as casualties mounted. Other German soldiers have gathered around, watching their sergeant examine the American motorcycles. One of them, a young private fresh from training, asks if they can use these captured machines. The sergeant nods. Yes, they can use them. The WLA is simple enough that any rider familiar with motorcycles can adapt quickly, but using them means facing the psychological reality that every soldier in this maintenance bay now understands. The Americans have so many of these that losing dozens, no hundreds, barely registers. They'll build more. They'll ship more. They'll keep coming with more equipment than Germany can destroy. A lieutenant arrives surveying the captured motor pool. He asks about serviceability. The sergeant reports that most of the Harleys are operational, requiring only fuel and minor maintenance. The lieutenant nods, making notes. These motorcycles will be put into service with German units, pressed into the Wehrmacht's order of battle because Germany needs every vehicle it can field. This was standard practice. The Germans used captured equipment throughout the war. French motorcycles, Soviet motorcycles, American trucks, British weapons, anything that could be maintained, and supplied went into service because German production couldn't meet demand. But using captured American equipment meant acknowledging that the enemy's industrial surplus exceeded Germany's frontline production. It meant admitting that the Americans could afford to leave behind, in a minor withdrawal from one small sector of one theater of war, more motorcycles than some German units received as original issue. The psychological effect of such realizations spread through the Wehrmacht like a slow poison, undermining the confidence that had carried German forces through the early war years. The sergeant knows the R-75 is technically superior. He knows the Zündapp KS 750 is a better motorcycle for military applications. He knows German engineering represents the finest traditional craftsmanship in the world. And he knows with the cold certainty of mathematical reality that none of it matters. 73 Harley-Davidsons sitting in one captured depot in Tunisia. 90,000 built, parts for 30,000 more. This was what defeat looked like when dressed in olive-drab paint and equipped with Springer front forks. The Americans also understood something the Germans missed. The motorcycle itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the system, the training, the supply, the maintenance, the replacement pipeline, the industrial base that could lose equipment faster than the enemy could destroy it, and still maintain numerical superiority. The WLA wasn't a marvel of engineering. It was a component in a military-industrial machine so vast that its full scope remained incomprehensible to those fighting against it. In Milwaukee, Harley-Davidson workers, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war, assembled motorcycles at rates that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. They worked 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each worker specialized in specific tasks, performing the same operations hundreds of times daily with speed born of repetition. The assembly line moved with mechanical precision, each station adding components until a complete motorcycle emerged at the end, ready for Army inspection. This wasn't craftsmanship in the traditional sense. No single worker built an entire motorcycle. No master mechanic lovingly assembled each engine. But the result was production that sustained operations across a global war. When a WLA broke down in Burma, replacement parts shipped from Milwaukee reached India, then were distributed through the military supply system to forward units. When a batch of motorcycles was destroyed in a bombing raid in Italy, replacement machines arrived within weeks. The system worked because it was designed to work at scale. German industry never achieved this level of systemization. BMW and Zündapps remained relatively traditional manufacturers even during the war, relying on skilled workers performing complex operations. Quality remained high, but quantity remained limited. The Germans tried to increase production through forced labor and concentration camp workers, but this created new problems. Untrained forced laborers couldn't maintain the precision required for complex machinery. Sabotage became a constant concern. Quality declined even as demand increased. By 1944, the situation had become critical. Allied bombing systematically targeted German industry, destroying factories, disrupting transportation networks, and killing workers. Raw materials became scarce as imports stopped and mining operations suffered damage. The synthetic fuel program that kept the Wehrmacht mobile consumed resources that could have produced other war materials. Germany was simultaneously fighting a war, maintaining occupied territories, building wonder weapons like jet aircraft and V-2 rockets, and trying to sustain basic industrial production, all with an economy smaller than that of the United States even before the war began. The WLA, meanwhile, continued rolling off American assembly lines. Production actually increased in 1944. Despite the war going well for the Allies, the motorcycles weren't even critically important. American forces preferred jeeps for most roles, and the WLA served mainly in military police, courier, and escort duties. But the Americans built them anyway because they could, because the industrial capacity existed, because workers were trained, because supply chains functioned, because the system could produce motorcycles while simultaneously producing everything else the war required. In Tunisia, the German sergeant shuts down the captured Harley. The engine dies with a final cough, leaving silence in the motor pool. He looks at his fellow soldiers, sees the same understanding reflected in their eyes. They've all done the mathematics. They all understand what these motorcycles represent. Some wars are won by bravery, some by tactical brilliance, some by superior weapons or better training. This war would be won by industrial capacity, by the side that could build more, ship more, replace more, sustain more. And standing in this motor pool, surrounded by 73 mass-produced American motorcycles, every German soldier present knows which side that is. The story doesn't end in Tunisia. WLA motorcycles served in every theater of war. They liberated towns across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, earning the nickname Liberator from grateful civilians who saw them ridden by Allied soldiers. They hauled radio equipment across Pacific islands. They carried messengers through Italian mountains. They escorted convoys in India and patrolled streets in China. Wherever American forces operated, the WLA followed, not because it was the best motorcycle ever built, but because there were enough of them to equip an entire global military force. After the war ended in 1945, the remaining production orders were canceled. Surplus WLAs flooded the civilian market, selling for a fraction of their production cost. Young American soldiers returning home bought them, stripping off military equipment and customizing them for civilian use. These modified motorcycles became the foundation of post-war motorcycle culture, leading to the chopper movement and the rise of motorcycle clubs. The WLA's abundance made motorcycling accessible to an entire generation. Many of those surplus motorcycles ended up in the Soviet Union, which had received over 30,000 under Lend-Lease. These machines, preserved during the Cold War in a country with limited access to Western parts and no customization culture, survived in near original condition. Today, former Soviet countries are major sources of WLA parts and restoration projects. Their motorcycles, preserved by the same circumstances that made them seem expendable during the war, now serve as reminders of an industrial achievement that helped win a global conflict. The production achievement represented by the WLA extended far beyond motorcycles. It demonstrated what American industry could accomplish when fully mobilized. The same principles that enabled Harley-Davidson to build 90,000 motorcycles enabled Ford to produce one, but 24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at Willow. Run enabled Kaiser shipyards to launch Liberty ships faster than Germany could sink them. Enabled American factories to produce more aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. This was the arsenal of democracy in action, not a slogan, but a reality built on assembly lines running 24 hours a day, powered by workers who might have been teachers or shop clerks or homemakers before the war. They learned new skills, adapted to industrial work, and sustained production that buried the Axis powers under an avalanche of equipment. The Germans built superior individual weapons. The Japanese showed remarkable ingenuity and resource-constrained designs, but neither could match American volume. The BMW R75 remained a magnificent motorcycle. The Zündapp KS 750 performed admirably in harsh conditions. Both represented the peak of their era's engineering. But by 1945, BMW had built fewer than 17,000 R75s. Zündapp built fewer than 19,000 KS 750s. Harley-Davidson built over 90,000 WLAs, plus parts for 30,000 more, without breaking stride in a production surge that included aircraft engines, airplane components, and other military equipment. In that disparity lay the outcome of the war, not determined by any single battle or campaign, but by the accumulated weight of industrial production that eventually crushed Axis resistance through sheer material superiority. Germany fought brilliantly, often achieving tactical victories against numerically superior forces. But brilliance has limits. Resources don't, at least not when you're America. In 1944, with factories running at double their pre-war capacity and supply ships crossing the oceans in convoys so large they stretched to the horizon, the outcome was inevitable. The German sergeant in Tunisia never forgot that February day when he examined the captured Harleys. After the war, in interviews conducted decades later, he spoke about the moment when he counted 73 motorcycles and realized what American production numbers meant for the war's outcome. He described the sinking feeling, the mathematical certainty that no amount of tactical skill could overcome such industrial disparity. Other German veterans shared similar moments of realization, seeing American supply dumps, counting aircraft overhead, witnessing the endless convoys of trucks and tanks. The WLA wasn't a wonder weapon. It wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't even particularly impressive by performance standards. But it was there in overwhelming numbers, everywhere American forces operated, supported by supplies that never ran out, maintained by systems that kept working. And its presence represented something far more significant than its crude engineering suggested. The industrial might of a nation that could bury its enemies in equipment while barely straining its productive capacity. 73 motorcycles in one motor pool in Tunisia. 90,000 built, parts for 30,000 more. This was what American industrial mobilization looked like when you stood on the receiving end. This was the weapon that won the war. Not any single tank or plane or ship, but the system that could produce them faster than the enemy could destroy them. The Wehrmacht mechanics who examined those captured Harley-Davidsons understood this immediately. They did the math. They knew what it meant. They realized Germany could never win, not against an opponent who built 90,000 motorcycles as a side project while conquering half the world with the main effort. The flathead engine wasn't sophisticated. The Springer front suspension was outdated. The 3-speed transmission was simple. None of it mattered. What mattered was that American workers, most of them new to industrial production, could build these machines by the tens of thousands and ship them across oceans and support them with supply chains that never failed, and replace them faster than combat could destroy them. That was the real weapon. That was what Germany couldn't match. And standing in that captured motor pool in Tunisia in February 1943, the Wehrmacht mechanics knew it. The thunder of American industrial production had spoken. And the message was clear. You can't outproduce us. You can't outsupply us. You can't replace losses as fast as we can inflict them. And eventually, inevitably, we will bury you under an avalanche of steel and gasoline and sheer industrial persistence. The Harley-Davidson WLA, crude, simple, unsophisticated, and utterly overwhelming, delivered that message to every German soldier who examined one. The war would continue for 2 more years, but the outcome was already written in production statistics and assembly line outputs. Germany was fighting the arithmetic of industrial warfare, and the arithmetic was merciless. In the end, the WLA's greatest contribution wasn't its performance in combat. It was what it represented about the nation that built it. A country that could produce 90,000 motorcycles while simultaneously building hundreds of thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of tanks, possessed industrial capacity beyond anything Germany could counter. The captured Harley-Davidsons sitting in that motor pool weren't just motorcycles. They were evidence. They were proof. They were the mathematical certainty of defeat written in mass-produced American steel. And the Wehrmacht mechanics who examined them knew, with cold clarity, exactly what they were looking at.